Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are in the country. It's Dan Sandink here from Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Thanks very much for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting presentation. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone how we do questions and answers or the discussion period during the webinar. If you could use the question and answer function in the webinar software there, and we'll collect all the questions during the webinar, and we'll save all questions until the end, and we'll have a discussion. I believe we'll have about 50 minutes of presentation and some time for discussion afterward. I think we've got a pretty good crowd here because we've got, of course, a very timely webinar and an extremely interesting topic by a couple of very knowledgeable researchers at Western University. And those researchers are Emilio Hong, who is currently a research engineer and PhD student at Western. This is one of the damage surveys he's been on, one of the several he's been on over the past 5 years. He's also done damage surveys following the Angus 2014 tornadoes in Windsor, Ontario in 2016 and Quebec in 2017. And he actually presented to our group a few months ago on damage inspections following the Hurricane Irma. He's also involved in the Northern Tornadoes project, which is currently ongoing with a number of partners, I believe, led at Western University. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this project in the coming months or years. And this project involves identifying tornadoes based on aerial imagery and tree fall patterns. So going beyond just observations that we typically use to confirm tornado sightings. So we'll have a very improved data set for tornadoes in Canada after this project is completed. And we also have Aaron Jaff, who is currently a master's student in wind engineering and also a research engineer at Western. Aaron is also involved in the Northern Tornadoes project and is involved in some pretty good research on residential buildings and wind risk, which you can read a bit about in the bios. So we're very happy to have Emilio and Aaron here to talk about their findings following the recent tornado outbreak in Ottawa-Gatineau. And I will pass it over to them.
Thanks for the introduction, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emilio Hong, and presenting with me today is Aaron Jaffe. We're from Western University, and we work on the Northern Tornadoes project. The Northern Tornadoes project is a joint collaboration project with Environment Canada to study tornadoes in Canada. Today, we'll be talking about our findings in Ottawa. On September 21st, an outbreak of tornadoes occurred in the Ottawa region. We surveyed this damage following the storm, and we'll be discussing some of our findings today. So here's a brief agenda on what we'll be talking about today. First, I'll go over some general facts about the storm. We'll next discuss some of the damage assessment tools that we've utilized for damage surveys. After that, we'll talk about the three main areas we surveyed. These areas are all communities in the Ottawa area: Dunrobin, Gatineau, and Nepean. The Northern Tornadoes project, the tornadoes that will be examined occurred on September 21st. In total, there were 6 tornadoes. The 2 of us were able to survey the 2 largest tornadoes. These 2 tornadoes have been categorized as EF3 and EF2. 1 tornado was considered an EF1. The remaining tornadoes have so far been categorized as EF0. For those not familiar with the EF scale, these are categorizations related to wind speeds for tornadoes. These wind speeds are 225 to 265 for EF3, 180 to 220 kilometers an hour for EF2, 135 to 175 kilometers an hour for EF1, and 90 to 130 for EF0. These wind speeds are rounded to the nearest 5 kilometers, as seen in the table. It is important to note that the EF scale is really a damage scale, and these wind speeds are estimates based on observations of damage, not direct measurements. 4 of these tornadoes occurred in Ontario, and the other 2 occurred in Quebec. So here we have an image from Google Earth marking the tornado tracks. The white dot in the middle depicts downtown Ottawa's location. The tornado track to the north of Ottawa is the EF3 tornado, which hit the communities of Kinburn, Dunrobin, and Gatineau in blue. Towards the south of Ottawa is the EF2 tornado in Nepean, marked in light green. Note that the Kinburn, Dunrobin, and Nepean areas are all communities of Ottawa. The most western tornado, marked in red, is the EF1 hitting Calabogie to White Lake. The last Ontario tornado is the one in Otter Lake. This tornado is marked in blue to the north. The other two tornadoes in the Quebec areas are in Bascatone, hitting the reservoir there, and Val-des-Bois. We are currently getting KBM, a forestry company, to conduct aerial surveys for us in order to get more information about tree falls in areas with lower population densities. So here is a brief summary of the events. On September 21st, the Calabogie to White Lake tornado was not confirmed immediately. From a Northern Tornadoes Project ground survey, we believed it was likely that the tornado touched down. It was confirmed on September. I'll now go over some of the meteorological details that have been provided to me courtesy of Leslie Elliott, a meteorologist on this project. Here are some of the meteorological conditions surrounding the event. From the Upper Air Storm Prediction Center mesoanalysis, there was riding approaching upper troughs and upper level jets causing a favorable area for enhanced lift. Additionally, the Weather Prediction Center tracked low pressure throughout northeast Ontario, resulting in warm, moist, southerly surface flow for most of the southern Ontario and southern portions of Quebec. Behind the warm front, by 5 p.m. local time, the cold front moved through eastern Ontario and southern Quebec. These conditions created lift mechanisms. So there are four main ingredients to a strong supercell environment. These ingredients, as seen in the figure, are instability, moisture, lifting mechanisms, and wind shear. As described in the previous slide, there were great lift mechanisms. The instabilities and wind shears were remarkably high that day and higher than expected. These conditions created ideal circumstances for the creation of supercells. Here is some of the radar imagery of the EF1 and EF3 tornadoes that day. These supercell structures are visible west of Calabogie and continue to travel eastward for over 1.5 hours at wind speeds of 140 plus kilometers an hour. As these winds traveled further west, they continued to White Lake and dissipated. The supercell structure indicates the presence of a mesocyclone and signature hook echo formation in reflectivity scans. The second tornado formed southwest of Kinburn and tracked northwestward across the Ottawa River into Gatineau, finally dissipating in Quebec. The Nepean system occurred around 5 p.m. The rotation was detected as the storm became a small supercell and tracked northeast for 30 minutes. The tornado formed west of Nepean and quickly moved northeast through the mostly residential areas and dissipated around 6:10. So Environment Canada forecasters issued warnings of potential severe weather prior to the event. This included special weather statements and upgrading to a tornado warning throughout the day. Supercell tracks were followed through eastern Ontario and southern Quebec. The storms lasted from 3:30 to 6:10 p.m. There were over 23 people injured, with 5 in critical condition, and 2,000 plus dwellings were affected. Significant damage to electrical infrastructure resulted in 261,000 people losing power. The damage experienced in Ottawa is some of the worst experienced in recent history. City officials compared the tornadoes to the 1998 ice storms that caused 5 million people to lose power and costed $1.1 billion in damages. From our personal experiences traveling to the area, many hotels and businesses were without food or power, and traffic lights were also without power throughout the Ottawa area. Although there has not been an officially recorded number of insurance claims, the provincial government has made $2.7 million available for victims, and the Red Cross has provided additional $1 million for temporary assistance in the form of shelter and food. Following the storm, there were 16 calls of people being trapped in their homes or in vehicles. For the sake of scale, the most expensive tornado in Canadian history is the 1987 Ottawa tornado, which was Edmonton tornado, which resulted in $148.4 million, or in today's dollars, $278.1 million. The 2014 Angus tornado caused $48 million, the 2011 Godrich tornadoes caused $110 million, and the August 2009 outbreak caused close to $100 million. Ground surveys were conducted in the area from September 22nd to 24th in Eastern Ontario and Gatineau. Additional analysis of the satellite imagery was available on September 24th to confirm 3 additional tornadoes. So one of the purposes of our damage survey is to estimate the wind speeds. For those unfamiliar, this process is unlike hurricanes. Tornado wind speeds are determined forensically. In a hurricane, equipment can be set up prior to the event, and this is able to measure the wind speeds for the event. For a tornado, this is not done due to the difficulties determining where and when the tornado will hit, and the determination of wind speed is done following the event. Following this event, we examine the damage to estimate the wind speed and categorize the damage. This is done using the EF scale. This scale gives damage indicators and the respective degrees of damage. This allows an estimation of wind speeds. For this damage survey, the Northern Tornadoes Project sent 2 teams. One of these teams consisted of meteorologist Dave Sills and Leslie Elliott. David Sills works for Environment Canada, and Leslie Elliott is a meteorologist working for Western, embedded in Environment Canada. Aaron and I are both engineers from Western. Additionally, we were joined from a team from the Ontario Storm Prediction Center, which consisted of 5 members, and the Quebec Storm Prediction Center, which had a team of 3. The Environment Canada teams focused on determining the track lengths and the width of the storm. The Ontario team mostly focused on the Ontario portion, and the Quebec teams observed portions of the damage in Ontario before examining the eastern bounds of the storm. So what is the Northern Tornadoes Project, and what are we trying to do? For this project, we're trying to gather all information on tornadoes in Canada. On average, there are 61.3 verified tornadoes a year in Canada. Some of these tornadoes are harder to identify as they hit unpopulated areas, and there are no reports of damage. To fill in these knowledge gaps, this project tries to study these areas to find these tornadoes. One of the primary damage indicators in this project is the evidence of tree damage. In 2017, this project was able to identify 9 new tornadoes and improve the data on 9 other tornadoes. So far in 2018, this project has investigated tornadoes in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. This year, this project has identified 10 new tornadoes and improved data on 4. This project provides archival quality data in the form of high-resolution aerial photos. The image shown is an aerial photo of Quetico tornado in 2017. Quetico is in northern Ontario towards the west side. This image has a 10-centimeter resolution of tree damage. Newer photos on this project have increased resolution of 5 centimeters. For these tornadic events, the project tries to capture all possible information. This includes documenting any damage that may be caused from the storm. The goal is to archive this data so it is publicly available for other parties and provide a complete data set for all tornadic events in Canada. So currently only the ground survey has been performed for the Ottawa tornadoes. The aerial surveys have been delayed due to the weather conditions and aircraft availability. The Ontario ground surveys were conducted on September 22nd to 24th. This survey was to estimate the bounds of the tornado and would assist in determining the areas for the aerial survey. This is determined by finding the thresholds of damage from the storm. One of the objectives of the ground survey is to capture everything that can be seen from the ground. Ideally, this means going door to door and examining every single structure that was affected by the storm. This includes noting the structures that were not damaged from the storm. This is needed to be done as soon as possible following the event due to the immediate cleanup following the storm. Ground surveys also allow us to talk to residents and clarify some details. These details include such things as determining the context of damage. Sometimes these are just repairs on a building that were being undertaken, or determining if there were wide openings in the building, such as leaving the garage door open or the windows. With the ground survey, we want the finer details of the damage as well. This includes examining the connections that would fail and the quality of construction. In cases where the roofs have come off, these connections are used to determine the strength of the building. Small details on buildings allow us to determine if the quality of construction was poor, average, or well constructed. So what are we using for these damage surveys? We currently use GPS tagging cameras. We try to take as many pictures as possible of a location to give us a good snapshot of the location. The GPS systems allow us to quickly identify with which building certain damage is associated with. These are also useful in determining the thresholds of damage. The company we use for aerial surveys primarily investigates trees for forestry purposes. Their primary business is looking at whole forests, and with that information determining the tree species, number of trees, ages, and sizes. They have multiple different planes which we have utilized on this project and have operated in many different provinces in Canada. Additionally, they have LiDAR, which uses lasers to get imagery and that we have used to examine trees. With the Northern Tornadoes project, we have used ArcGIS for mapping. With Western Libraries, we have started using the Collector app in damage surveys. This Collector app is still a work in progress, but uses common damage indicators and the degrees of damage to give a quick method of categorizing observed damage. Ideally, this app will be better utilized in the field going forward. We are currently using drones for some aerial imagery. There are some problems with this, as sometimes sites are close to no-fly zones. These drones are useful in locating damage in forests and allow for better examination of roofs. This will be further discussed by Aaron. So here's another image from Google Maps. This one shows the sites that we surveyed. The downtown Ottawa area is labeled in the figure. To the west of Ottawa, the main downtown Ottawa area is Dunrobin, and to the north is Gatineau. This is part of the same storm track. To the south of the main downtown Ottawa area, we have Nepean, which is its own damage track. So this leads me into discussing Dunrobin. In this map, we see the red outlined area is the storm track, and the circle area is the Dunrobin area. This was part of the EF3 track, and the hardest, we'll be discussing the worst hit areas in Dunrobin. So circled here is the hardest hit area in Dunrobin. We were unable to examine this area due to the gas leaks present in the area. From driving through the main street, however, we were able to see multiple buildings with damage. In total, the whole Dunrobin community had 60 homes which were damaged. So circled here now is the area that I was able to damage survey. This area had residential homes and will be the basis of what I'll be talking about for Dunrobin. So here's a zoomed in portion of the circled area. The highest degree of damage found in Dunrobin is circled on this map here towards the bottom. So this building lost all of its walls and has been left with a basement and a foundation. The debris has all been blown to the northeast of the building, with its contacts spread out all over the place. Examining the house, there are different degrees of damage to consider. Tornado ratings are based on these degree of damage. As a result, this building will be heavily impact the damage rating issued for this event. This building does not appear to be a degree of damage 10, as the slab has not been completely swept clean. The walls have collapsed on all sides of the building. With this in mind, this still brings into the question if it is an EF3 or EF4 tornado. The lower bound wind speeds are still in the EF3 range of 225 to 265. However, the expected and upper bounds are both in EF4 categorization. So based on the construction of the building, our engineering judgment led us to the lower bound range. The construction of this building does not appear particularly strong. The foundation is still present, but examining the wall to foundation connections, it appears as though multiple nails were missing. So some of the vinyl finishing of the flooring was still present on the building. This is not a good sign for the construction of the building. It appears as though the walls of the building were held by a few nails. Overall, this construction was lacking. The walls appear to have come down completely with the poor nailing, and parts of the vinyl siding are present on these walls. If we examine the trees in the background, we'll notice these trees still have leaves and branches. You can see parts of the vinyl siding hanging in these trees. Many of these trees are still standing in the storm. The nails here do meet the code requirements to go through the plate, subfloor, and joist. However, compared to the strength of the minimum requirements for anchor foundations, the nails have roughly up to a tenth of the uplift resistance and a third of the shear. The wall sheathing here does not span across the bottom plate joint, which further supports that this building is a below average to average structure. In comparison, here's a photo from the EF4 tornado that hit Alonso, Manitoba. Our team was able to investigate this tornado earlier in the summer. This tornado completely destroyed a shed in the image. Here the trees are mostly bare, with many of the branches torn off. The trees here have either been knocked down from the winds or mostly stripped of branches and leaves. The same could not be said for the damage in Dunrobin. This would support the hypothesis that the storm was not EF4. Here's a truss that has come off the building with its top plate. As can be seen, this truss is still attached to the base plate. It's believed that this truss is from the gable end of the building. It's also believed that the sheathing on the gable covered the truss space and the edge of the top plate, becoming detached from the building simultaneously. In addition to the nailed connection failure, the sheathing on this element is not continuous. This is evident with the plywood up to the bottom of the roof of the wall. An overlapping joint would have likely increased the resistance. Observing the immediate nearby buildings, there appear to be similar failures circled in red here. Nearby, the church on the main street here has experienced damage to the top of the roof. The top peak of the church here has been damaged. It's a stranger case since most of the shingles are still intact. However, there is significant sheathing damage and damage to the trusses. Here we have a building to one of the neighbors of the house and a house across the street. The neighboring house to the left image here with the words "Our Happy Place" above the doorway has multiple wall and roof failures and was the neighbor. Across the street, the picture on the right, this building had a second story completely collapse and walls fail. These are consistent with a DOD 8, supporting the EF3 rating. Next, we'll move towards northeast, to the circled location where one of the homes has been damaged. Here we see the front of this house. According to residents in the neighborhood, this house had recently undergone many renovations prepared to be sold. This building has suffered significant damage to its garage, with several walls failing and the roof coming off. One of the front rooms is completely exposed. You'll see that towards the right of the image. And the garage has started to cave in. As we move to the side of the building, we see that the leeward wall has come out completely. The front side of the building has experienced significant sheathing damage. Most of the trusses have stayed intact, and the roof has mostly slid off of its supports, with the failed wall at the back of the building. The back of the building has most of the sheathing still intact. Towards the back of the building, we see that the second story has completely failed. There's some siding damage, but most of the damage on the building has occurred on the garage. These building failures have attributed more to the walls of the building opposed to the roof. In the backyard of this building, we see a dumpster here. This dumpster was originally located at the site of the church I had shown earlier. It is estimated to have flown in the air for 200 to 250 meters. With this information, we can use the dumpster for debris movement calculations in the future. I'll move further downwind now to the observations found towards the back end of this community, circled here. Here are 3 different pictures of houses in the area losing sheathing. These images show 3 different homes with high degrees of damage. The top right image here shows a truss coming off the roof. There were less debris effects on these buildings, and there were more significant shingle and siding losses on these buildings. This image is a particularly interesting building case here. This building from the street only appeared to lose shingles on the top roof. However, speaking with the homeowners, this building has been shifted off of its foundation. This building will have to be rebuilt since it's not considered stable according to building inspectors. It's difficult to see this damage from the outside. I'll be passing off the presentation to Aaron now to talk about our findings in Gatineau and Nepean.
Thanks, Emilio. So Gatineau, Quebec was another severely damaged location from the outbreak that was surveyed by our team. This damage was caused by the same tornado that swept through Dunrobin, which then crossed the Ottawa River and hit Quebec. This map shows the approximate path of the tornado in red, with Dunrobin in the center of the path and the Quebec portion at the east end in the black circle. Thankfully, much of that circled section was rural land. However, the Mont-Bleu neighborhood was hit hard at the east end of the circled section, which is where we surveyed. There were no casualties. However, news sources stated 14 people in this area were injured from the storm, with 2 in critical condition. 215 buildings were damaged or destroyed, with hundreds more affected. There were also up to 100,000 residents on the Quebec side of the border without power for varying lengths of time. This figure shows the Mont-Bleu neighborhood that we surveyed. The blue pins show the location of the hundreds of pictures we took, and the blue lines show where we'd surveyed, mostly by foot. The surveyed area measured about 800 by 400 meters. Normally, we would survey a larger area, but due to time restrictions, we focused on gathering information from the most severely damaged structures. This is as opposed to locating the extent of damage to determine a tornado path, length, and width, seen as this was something already performed by the Quebec Storm Prediction Center. Our team estimated that this was low EF3 damage, with maximum wind speeds around 240 kilometers an hour, which is in general agreement with the numbers that Environment Canada gave. On the following slides, I'll take you through the various damage we observed in the area. This photo, taken on the top of a hill facing eastward, shows the path of the tornado through the neighborhood. After crossing the Ottawa River, it first hit the residential homes behind this picture, then the low-rise apartment buildings in the center of the photo, followed by the mid-rise apartment buildings in the background, where it dissipated near Auto Route 5 shortly afterward. I'll go through how each of these types of structures was affected. The most common type of structure damaged in the area was low-rise apartment buildings. Before I go over each area of damage and building type, I'll go back to this map and highlight the area we're looking at with a red box to make the presentation easier to follow. This pre-disaster photo, taken from Google Maps, shows the 2 most common types of low-rise buildings in the area that were damaged. The majority were 2 to 4 story rectangular flat roof structures. They are wood frame built with masonry cladding, similar to your typical North American wood frame house. This table shows the damage indicator associated with the low-rise apartment buildings. These structures match the description of construction associated with this damage indicator well, making wind speeds from their damage easier to estimate. This damage indicator shows the 6 degrees of damage, ranging from DOD1, threshold of visible damage, to near total destruction of the top 2 stories at DOD6. Each degree of damage has an associated damage description with an expected wind speed, a lower bound wind speed, and an upper bound wind speed in kilometers an hour. The most severe damage in this event, as you will see, was associated with DODs 4 and 5, which is why the estimated wind speed of 240 kilometers an hour falls between the expected values of these 2 DODs. These 2 damage photos from our survey are the exact same models of apartment buildings seen on the last slide. The vast majority of them had their windows or doorways broken by debris, especially on the west side of the building where the tornado came from. Large or entire walls of brick cladding were also removed from several of the buildings, such as the one on the right. More significantly, dozens of these structures had lost their entire roof or large sections of their roof, removed. Although this is less obvious with photos of flat roof structures from the ground, you can clearly see that the roofs are missing when looking through the windows on the top floor of the structures. Once removed, these roofs break apart and turn into dangerous projectiles in the debris field, damaging more structures downwind. The fact that these structures were located at the bottom of a hill could have played a role relating to debris impacts as well. Many structures also had external walls collapse in their top floors. This mostly happened to corner walls on the windward side of buildings, like in the photo on the left. The photo on the right shows a building that actually had its entire back wall of the upper floor removed on the leeward east-facing side of the structure. You can tell we're looking at the leeward side by noticing the mostly intact windows. This is a sign of how strong the winds were, or perhaps faulty construction, if this wall was not properly secured to the rest of the structure. This type of damage was the most severe in the area and was a main factor towards the decision of an EF3 tornado. Although the area was dominated by flat roofs, several other roof shapes were also observed. These included hip roofs, such as the photo on the left, gable roofs, and other shapes, such as the photo on the right. The hip roofs appeared to fare better than the flat roofs, usually losing shingles and sheathing, but only sometimes losing sections of roof structure, such as the photo on the left. This is not surprising, as much past research has shown hip roofs to be stronger than other roof types due to their aerodynamic shape and roof-to-wall connections on all four sides of the structure, as opposed to gable roofs, which only have roof-to-wall connections on two sides of the structure and not their gable ends. More research needs to be done on how roofs with odd or complex shapes fail in severe wind events. We believe a factor that contributed to the failure of some non-flat roof trusses and not others is the roof-to-wall connections. As many of you likely know, these connections are what hold the roofs of structures down during severe winds. In wood frame structures, typical of North America, the code requires the use of toenails for these connections, circled in these photos, which nail the roof trusses to the walls. The most common practice in Canada is to use three nails for each connection, but you'll notice that all the connections in these photos feature only one or two nails. Past research has shown this difference in nails significantly reduces the wind speed at which roofs fail in severe winds, with some studies showing reductions of up to 33% in failure wind speeds. This was studied by members of our team in depth following the Angus, Ontario tornado in 2014, where missing nails contributed significantly to roof failures. Additionally, the nails in the top two photos are very close to the ends of the trusses. We suspect that sometimes this causes the tips of the trusses to break off at a lower wind speed than the actual connection would. Evidence of this was seen both here and in other past events. Wind engineers are strongly pushing for wider use of hurricane clips, especially in tornado-prone areas. These clips are relatively inexpensive and significantly strengthen the roof-to-wall connections of wood frame structures. Another type of damage we commonly observed in this area was to vehicles. Unfortunately, it is still difficult to estimate wind speeds based on damage to or movement of cars and other vehicles in a tornado, although much research is being done in this area. The aerodynamics involved in simulating vehicle motion and lift from tornadoes is very complex, and there are many variables that result in large variations in the results. Having vehicles as a damage indicator in the EF scale in the future would be useful, seeing as they are so commonly damaged in tornadoes. Nevertheless, the vehicles in tornadoes make for some compelling photos and show the dangers of being in a car during these storms. One of these dangers is from debris, as seen in the photo on the left. This picture shows a 2x4 that went straight through the windshield of the car and into the passenger seat. Glass and windows offer minimal protection from severe winds and should be avoided during these storms. The other danger of being in a vehicle during a tornado is that they are susceptible to being rolled or thrown by the storm. The photo on the right doesn't look like much at first, and it wasn't until we walked around to the other side of the structure that we realized that there was a car covered in debris that had been rolled against the tree. Upwind and uphill of the apartment complexes, there was also some damage to residential houses. This area is once again highlighted on the map. For the most part, this damage was not as severe as the damage to the apartment buildings or the damage to residential houses in Ottawa, and consisted mostly of minor to moderate shingle and sheathing loss. However, these photos show a couple of the worst cases we observed. The house in the left photo lost its entire roof as well as some exterior walls. This damage was far more severe than anything seen on the other structures in the area, which immediately raises questions. At first, the assumption was that this was likely a construction deficiency. However, upon examining what the structure looked like pre-disaster on Google Maps Street View, it turned out that most of the missing front exterior wall consisted of large floor-to-ceiling windows. These were likely broken by debris during the storm, which is well known to increase the likelihood of roof failure, due to large internal pressures created from wind entering the structure. The photo on the right shows a house with a collapsed carport. There were a couple of these failures in the area, which is not surprising as carports are not as sturdy as a typical house. This one in particular is different in that it collapsed in place and was not blown away. This shows that it was not well connected to the rest of the house at the roof, which was confirmed again by pre-disaster photos. Whereas many carports share a continuous roof with the side of the house, this one was connected below the roof as its own structure instead. These are some of many examples of how seeing what a damaged structure looked like before the storm can be valuable. The final type of damaged structure we observed were a few EF scale defined mid-rise apartment buildings at the end of the tornado path. Unfortunately, we weren't granted access to the complex due to the danger of falling debris from the buildings. We were limited to taking photos from the adjacent street, as evidenced by the damaged photo locations lining one side of the highlighted area of interest. The main damage to the buildings seems to be broken windows and balconies. There also appears to be some metal sheeting coming off of the roof, but we were unable to investigate the extent of this. Much of the damage to these buildings was likely caused by debris from the upwind low-rise apartment buildings, and this hypothesis was supported by the large amount of debris scattered about the complex that crews were still cleaning up, and videos taken from residents of these apartments during the tornado. It is not surprising that this damage is lesser than the other areas, being at the end of the tornado track. About 90 minutes after the Dunrobin-Gatineau tornado struck, a second powerful tornado touched down near Kanata and swept through the Nepean suburb of Ottawa. Once again, this map shows the approximate path of the tornado in black. Unfortunately, the majority of that path is through residential neighborhood, and as a result, several hundred homes were damaged or destroyed, if not more. At least 80 hydro poles, as well as one of Ottawa's two major power substations, were severely damaged from the tornado, significantly contributing to the over 250,000 residents without power in the Ottawa-Gatineau area following the storm. A few more people were injured in this tornado, although the exact numbers are hard to separate from the Dunrobin event. As mentioned, it's very lucky and thankful that there were no casualties in this outbreak. These figures again show the surveyed areas represented by the blue lines and the locations of damage photos represented by the pins, overlaid with the estimated tornado path. The bottom figure shows a zoomed in portion of the worst damaged and most heavily surveyed area of the upper figure. Through a combination of ground and aerial surveys, we determined the path length of the tornado to be up to 23 kilometers and the maximum path width to be about 750 meters around the zoomed in portion of the map. We estimated the worst damage from the tornado to be EF2, with a maximum wind speed around 200 kilometers an hour. Significant, but a little less than the Dunrobin-Gatineau tornado. On the following slides, I'll take you through the various damages we observed along the path. The southeast suburb of Kanata was the westmost point where we found any damage. As I move through the different neighborhoods, west to east, following the path of the tornado, I'll once again show this map and circle the area I'm about to discuss in red. Having a bit more time to survey this tornado, we tried to find the extent of damage as well as the most damaged structures. In other words, where the tornado started and ended and how wide it was. In Kanata, the worst damage we saw were a couple uprooted and snapped trees, as seen in these two photos. No structural damage to the homes was found. Although this could have been part of the tornado path, it was more likely just strong straight line wind damage associated with the storm, seen as the damage was sparse. The area between Kanata and the first confirmed sign of the tornado 2 kilometers east of here was forested, making ground surveying infeasible. To determine whether there's any sign of a tornado path in this forested area, we used our DJI Mavic Air drone shown here. As mentioned earlier by Emilio, drone usage is one of our newer and most important tools in locating damage that ground surveys may miss. Unfortunately, one of the limitations is the abundance of no-fly zones located throughout the country, especially in more populated areas. This figure shows the no-fly zones indicated by red circles in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. This made using the drone difficult, especially considering that these black circles show the areas of our surveys. Although residents and media can get away with ignoring the no-fly zones to some extent, it's something we have to be careful about as researchers. We did manage, however, to fly the drone in the east end of Kanata, just outside of the Ottawa Airport no-fly zone. Here, we didn't see any confirmed tornado path through the forest that connected the damage in Kanata to the rest of the path. A couple kilometers east of Kanata, we found the westmost confirmed tornado damage, along the path in the neighborhood of Bell's Corners, circled on the map. The photo on the left shows a schoolyard in the area, with the building itself seen on the right side of the left picture. There were several trees down surrounding the building and some metal sheathing that had been removed from the structure itself. The photo on the right shows an adjacent forested area that had a line of snapped, uprooted, and leaning trees going through it in the direction the tornado traveled. I've pointed out a few of them with arrows in case they're difficult to see. There were also some trees that were leaning on power lines and a few structures that had lost some shingles in the area. A few more kilometers east, the next area surveyed was Arlington Woods. This neighborhood had the most visually devastating damage along the Nepean tornado path. The area was known for its abundance of 80 to 100-foot tall pine trees, and in some locations, nearly all of them had been snapped off at mid-height. In this photo, nearly all the trees in the background, like the tree in the foreground on the left, have been snapped. We made use of Google Street View, once again, to look at the difference between before the tornado hit. The contrast is rather eye-opening. These photos show two of the many damaged homes in the area, showing significant damage to the roof structure. You may notice, however, that the shingles are still on these houses and the roofs seem to have collapsed inwards instead of being lifted off the walls. This is because the broken pine trees, as seen in the last slide, turned into debris missiles that fell or flew into houses and cars. As a result, this area may not have had the most significant winds in the tornado, but it likely had the most significant damage. A couple residents described the area looking like a war zone, which seemed like an accurate description to us, and we know it would have looked a lot worse before the roads were cleared and branches cut. These photos clearly show the extent of damage caused by the falling trees. The photos on the left and top right show tree trunks slicing through roof trusses and walls, and the photo on the bottom right shows one of the many severely damaged cars in the area. Research has shown that trees sometimes shield houses from direct wind damage in severe wind events, especially in hurricanes, but once the winds become strong enough to snap and uproot the trees, this protection becomes a hazard. This kind of damage made it difficult at times to determine which damage to houses were directly caused by the wind. Therefore, using the trees damage indicator in EF scale would be the best way of estimating wind speed in this neighborhood. Although most of the damage in Arlington Woods was caused by tree fall, there was also some direct wind damage to the houses as well as some other structures. The photo on the left shows some significant shingle and sheathing damage to a roof, which is at least mostly caused by direct wind, evidenced by the intact roof trusses on the left side of the photo. The two broken roof trusses on the right side of the photo were likely caused by some kind of debris impact. The photo on the right depicts a church in the area that was significantly damaged. Many of the shingles are missing, as well as the upper portions of the sheathing. Upon closer inspection, however, it doesn't seem to be a very well-built roof. The roof frame is spaced rather far apart, limiting the hold-down force available to the sheathing. Failures such as these, although they may seem minor compared to the loss of an entire roof, will often lead to significant financial loss and sometimes the demolition of the building due to water and wind entering the structure and ruining the contents. Dividing Arlington Woods and Craig Henry, which will be discussed after, the next area surveyed was Greenbank Road. Greenbank Road itself was one of the few areas in Nepean that we were unable to reach during the survey. It was closed off during our time there to repair the damaged hydro poles, seen in the photo on the left. This photo was taken by CBC and shows how bad the area looked right after the storm, with many hydro poles snapped at the base and others snapped in the middle and dangling in the air. A common problem we see in tornadoes is that the failure of one or a few hydro poles will put stress on the wires and cause the collapse of many other poles. Despite our restrictions, we managed to survey most of the area using connecting streets. The photo on the right was taken of a field adjacent to Greenbank Road that had many concrete and metal poles collapsed or leaning. An interesting thing to note is that the poles in this photo all seem to be facing different directions, although it's difficult to make any definite conclusions about the reasons for this. On the other side of Greenbank Road was the Craig Henry neighborhood, which was also greatly affected by the tornado. This area had the worst direct wind damage along the Nepean tornado path. Hundreds of houses had shingles and sheathing damaged, and a large portion of the trees were snapped or uprooted. Several houses, such as the ones seen in this photo, lost significant portions of the roof in the storm as well. The photo on the left shows the worst damaged house that had roof trusses missing as well as a collapsed exterior wall on the top floor. The photo on the right shows two more houses with significant roof loss. Something interesting to note, however, is that the rightmost house does not have any damage to the windows, as would usually be the case on the windward side of a structure with its roof missing, like in the photo on the left. This would seem to imply higher than expected wind speeds or faulty construction. This table shows the degrees of damage associated with the damage indicator of 1 to 2-story wood frame houses, which Emilio discussed earlier. In this case, the worst damage observed is DOD 6, which is what the estimated wind speed of 200 kilometers an hour was based upon. There were a few other interesting things we saw in this neighborhood as well. There were many fallen trees that caused damage, as depicted in the photo on the left. This was similar to Arlington Woods, but not to the same extent, as the trees were closer to the ground and most of them fell onto cars parked in driveways. There were also a few instances of debris, such as 2x4s, sticking into walls and roofs, like the photo on the right. A reminder of how easily debris can damage structures or cause significant harm to individuals. Tanglewood was the eastmost area that we surveyed, circled again on the map. The damage in this neighborhood was similar to that in Craig Henry, with lots of shingle and sheathing damage to typical wood frame houses, but no significant roof structure damage. Something different in this neighborhood is that there was also many areas with larger townhouse-like structures, seen in the two photos here. Many of these had entire roof surfaces of sheathing removed, seen on the gable roof on the left and the hip roof on the right. The good news for these structures is that they received little permanent damage, as sheathing and shingles are relatively easily replaced. The bad news is that the loss of sheathing means many of the inside contents could have been destroyed from wind and rain. The amount of sheathing loss without roof structure damage indicates potentially weak sheathing connections, or more likely, strong roof-to-wall connections. It would have been interesting to find out whether any of these structures were equipped with hurricane clips. Generally, it is a good sign when failures of structures happen in the order listed on its damage indicator for the EF scale. For wood frame structures, this involves shingles failing first, then sheathing, then roof structure, followed by the walls. Out of order failures generally indicate poor connections in the items that failed unexpectedly. This is a photo that was posted by Hydro One of the damage to one of Ottawa's two major power substations, located in the Tanglewood neighborhood. Due to obvious electrical hazards, we weren't allowed near the site. According to Hydro One, the damage included the roofs being ripped off of two of their buildings and slamming into their infrastructure, the insulators and the wires. The damage was severe enough that the power had to be rerouted from other stations and wasn't restored to most houses, businesses, and traffic signals of Ottawa-Gatineau for 3 days. The repairs to this station itself are expected to take weeks. There have been thoughts towards burying or enclosing these stations to protect them from the elements, but this is both expensive and more difficult to maintain, as well as being a fire hazard. Although it appeared that the damage track ended at the east end of Tanglewood, ground surveys by other members of the Northern Tornadoes Project and satellite imagery suggest that the tornado went quite a bit further. The damage in this area was much less significant, although given more time, it would have been useful to survey this area more thoroughly on the ground. Our current estimate is that the path ends near Highway 417 in the upper right corner of the maps. This will be investigated further by aerial imagery in the near future. I will now pass it back to Emilio to give us some final thoughts.
So from the damage survey, we were able to determine the main storm tracks in Nepean and find some of the thresholds for the Kinburn, Dunrobin, and Gatineau storms. This information helped with determining our aerial survey tracks. In Dunrobin, we identified information that led us to the conclusion that the damage in Dunrobin was of EF3 level strength. This was based on evidence from several structures in the area and surrounding details. For the Nepean tornado, we examined many homes and were able to document a large number of houses that were damaged. Some of these houses experienced damage due to falling trees in the area. We were able to map out the damage throughout the Nepean neighborhood based on the photographs taken in the area. In Gatineau, we observed many connections with only 2 nails. The neighborhood had many low-rise structures affected by the storm. So as students and working on the beginning portions of this project, we try to take this as a learning experience going forward. There were many challenges with this damage survey due to the site access. This included large portions of Dunrobin due to gas leaks and electric wires, and transmission areas in Nepean due to live wires, and the apartment buildings in Gatineau due to debris and other hazards. Some of these areas would have been interesting case studies, but the lack of accessibility made observing damages very challenging. There were many issues getting to these locations due to the power failures in Ottawa, and transportation issues getting to the site. Some of these issues are to be expected with damage surveys. Going into this region, the power was out in the area, causing the search for accommodations to be difficult. As stated previously, there are many issues with drone flying in the area. During the survey, there were different opinions on how to best utilize our time following the event. With such a large-scale event, there are many structures that are affected that can be documented. Additionally, in this survey, the damaged tracks were very long, extending many kilometers. This led to long searches in determining the track lengths. It was difficult to be thorough due to these long tracks going through with a door-to-door approach surveying houses. To improve this, better familiarity with the app may help, and increased time and additional planning. There were also multiple different parties that were involved in the surveys, and the coordination of teams was at times difficult. Due to communication towers being knocked out in the area, the reception in the area was not always ideal, causing issue with contacting other groups. So moving forward, we are still waiting for the results of our aerial surveys. These aerial surveys will be flown along all of the 6 damage tracks and give high-resolution data. With this damage, we'll be able to identify the tree tracks properly. We are still currently working on databasing the incoming information. We are working on documenting how many structures we observed and matching up their locations. This will give us an idea of the extent of damage we were able to observe on our survey. We will study the different structures involved. With some of the structures, more detailed analysis will be carried out. As mentioned before, some of the most significantly damaged structures will be analyzed to determine the wind forces likely required to cause the observed failures. This will also help determine if the observed damage is in line with the current EF scale estimated wind speeds. Analysis will also be performed on debris found in the area. For tornadoes, tree fall is a useful indicator in determining the extent and path of the damage. From the aerial surveys, we will examine the tree damage, and this will be used to determine the range of damage along the track. So we'd like to acknowledge the help and support of the other members of the Northern Tornadoes Project. This project starts with the expertise of Drs. Gregory Kopp at Western University and David Sills at Environment Canada for their knowledge in wind engineering and meteorology, respectively. We'd like to thank Leslie Elliott with her help on several of the slides and information on the meteorological components of the project. We'd like to thank Sarah Stevenson and Connell Miller for their help this summer and going forward, with their contributions to the project in the form of damage surveying and engineering analysis. We'd like to thank our friends at the Western Libraries, particularly Liz Sutherland and Carolina Keiko, in their work on the project, including setting up the archiving of our data, setting up the app for in-field surveying, and mapping assistance. We'd also like to thank Joanne Kennel for her work on the project last year. We'd like to thank the other Environment Canada teams for their support in the field and their information. Without their help, it would be difficult to get access to some of the sites that we did. Finally, we'd like to thank ICLR for hosting us today and allowing us to present our findings, and you all for listening. We'd be happy to take any questions now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Very interesting information. So first, there's a couple of questions online here about access to the slides and so on. And so our plan is to make the slides available, and we'll be releasing a recorded version of this on ICLR's YouTube channel, hopefully by mid next week. So that should all be available, unless there are any issues with Emilio and Aaron. So please, those of you online, please do use the question and answer box to ask questions. In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions. So first, Emilio, you mentioned that one of the worst affected areas of Dunrobin, you weren't able to access this area due to a gas leak. And I'm wondering if, data in this area is lost permanently, or would you be soliciting homeowners or utility crews for pictures and that sort of thing to help fill some of the gaps?
Yeah, for that region, it would likely come down to that. I know there are other survey teams that maybe had access earlier in the day, or had communication with the fire crews and police officers. So that might give some insight into that. However, we'd have difficulties into looking for some of the specific things that we do on our damage surveys. I'm not sure if some of the meteorologists may have been able to take a look, but they would not be examining the same things we would. Yeah, the aerial survey will provide some information on the tree damage and such, but on the houses themselves, that it might be more difficult to come across this information.
Okay. And actually, we do have an offer from one of the attendees here, Norman. He's saying if you are looking for any images of the eastern end of the Nepean track, where would we send them? And you don't have your email addresses up here, but if you do have them handy, maybe Norman can send them your way.
Okay. Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. Is it easiest if you or Tracy share that, or should we type it in to the, we just type it to him, or say it out loud, whatever you just?
That's a good question. Emilio or Aaron, if you're not too busy, you can type it into the webinar chat thing, and then
I'll type it into the webinar chat box. Thanks.
Okay, there we go. Okay, another question is about how the wind speeds are determined. So you were talking about going on site and looking for, using the degree of damage scales and looking for some of the worst examples of damage. So my understanding is you go on site, find, say, a building that has some of the worst damage, and you classify the wind speed based on the worst examples of damage. And so, you know, Dunrobin, we have an EF3 estimated speed. Is it a valid question to ask, you know, assuming that tornado speed estimate is based on the worst examples of damage, that you would be able to make some sort of judgment based on, say, lower wind speeds that also cause damage in the area, and maybe, you know, a small portion of buildings were heavily damaged by EF3 winds, but maybe more buildings were damaged by EF2, EF1, EF0. So is that a valid question? And if so, could you, you know, provide a judgment on the relative impacts of the various wind speeds that would have been experienced, say, for example, in Dunrobin?
So yeah, that's definitely a valid question. You know, usually especially when you hear in the news what the wind speeds were for a tornado, they'll always give you the worst wind speed. So, you know, when you hear that it was an EF3 tornado with wind speeds of 250 kilometers an hour, that means the wind speeds were up to 250 kilometers an hour. But for sure, different areas will be damaged to different extents. And this is, I'll let Emilio speak toward Dunrobin in a second, but you can see this pretty clearly in the Nepean tornado, because the track was so long that, you know, of course, the tornado didn't, you know, have EF2 strength along the whole track. Some of the damage we found would have been EF1 and EF0. And this is something that definitely we will keep track of, but isn't as important to, I guess, the public. I don't know if Emilio has anything he wants to add to that.
Speaking towards the Dunrobin area, the focus was on those structures because they're the highest degree. Tornadoes are categorized based on the highest. With our analysis, we like to look at the main area and then move outwards to try and zone where we think EF3 level damage would be, EF2, EF1, and so on and so forth. This has actually been more worked on for our tree analysis. A lot of Joanne's work last year, she looked at large damage tracks for trees with the aerial survey imagery. And from there, the definitions in the EF scale currently are based on the percentage of trees down in an area. So what she was doing was looking at how many trees in a certain area, and then that would be categorized as one EF level, and then so on and so forth going outwards along the whole track. So we would have this section was EF3, this section EF2, so on and so forth.
Okay, very good. Another question. So you had some pictures, I think it was Aaron, of trusses with missing toenails, and you referred back to the Angus tornado, I read the paper on that, and that was a recurring theme there as well, missing toenails. And I'm wondering if you have any judgment on, say, proportion of the trusses. You got 3 examples here, but proportion of the trusses that you identified and how many of them did have missing nails. And I guess another question is, some of these look like potentially older examples. Were the code requirements consistent throughout, I guess, the construction era of all these buildings?
So yeah, that's a great question. So virtually all of the trusses we had at maximum 2 nails. So this obviously shows that, that's what they were assigned. Now the ones that have 1 are definitely some kind of error, but the ones that have 2, we know 3 nails are stronger, but I can't say for certain that, at the time where they built these structures, it's possible that 2 nails may have been okay. I don't know if the provisions are slightly different for Quebec, and I don't know. I know Quebec adopted the NBCC in about 2000, I think. So structures built nowadays all should have 3 toenails, but for sure it greatly reduces the strength only having 2, and a lot of the structures only had 2 that we saw. That we saw almost no roof trusses with 3 nails.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. A question for Emilio. You had that example of the house that appeared from the outside to have relatively minor damage in Dunrobin, I believe it was. There we go. Just a missing roof covering there, but the entire building was reported was shifted off the foundation. Do you have any sense of the anchoring that was used in this building and the era of construction, that sort of thing?
I wasn't able to get inside the building to check any of that, and from the outside, we were only really accessing the area from the street, so it was difficult to tell the anchoring for the building and how that would have caused the failure. My best guess would be that the anchoring wouldn't be particularly strong based on the other surrounding buildings, and it might be more of a result of less anchorage into the actual building or none present at all.
Yeah, okay. Actually, one of the first questions we had online here from Zohad, the question relates to what is the dominant driver of damage during the tornado, well, I guess any tornado event. Is it high central suction or higher tangential wind speed at the core wall? So I suppose uplift versus shear lateral loads. What's your thoughts on that?
So for this storm, I believe that it was more the high central suctions. This is due to the fact that most of the debris was relatively close to the building it had come from. I don't think any of the walls we had found were more than 10 to 20 meters away. If it was higher to tangential winds, I would expect these components to be blown much further away from the building due to the high speed being the causing factor.
Okay. Question from Beatrice. Is there any future strategy from Environment Canada to release path boundary estimates quickly after these types of events? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this will answer it directly, but I can speak a little bit towards that, because sometimes one of the challenges of, when we collaborate with Environment Canada and we go out to do our surveys, we're not looking for the exact same things, because sometimes they just want to get the path, the length and the width and the EF rating, and that's it. And we want to get a little bit more information than that. So they can usually get that information pretty quickly now. Sometimes, we want to hold back from saying anything to the media right away in case we find more. I don't know of any specific strategies they have to increase the speed at which they do that. I'm not sure if Emilio has anything to add or not.
Sometimes part of the issue with releasing a quick statement is at times we also have issues with the satellite imagery. I believe Environment Canada would have similar issues. It took us a good 3 days after the storm for us to have clear satellite imagery of the location, and that's what helped identify the track of another tornado that was confirmed. I can't speak from their side completely, but to get accurate imaging, it takes a lot due to the weather to get like appropriate storm tracks due to the clouds and such that they would have to fly over and such for that kind of work.
Okay. Question from Gary. Well, I think a couple of questions here, and I think so we've got questions about roof type and vulnerability. So you have several examples of apartment buildings that lost flat roofs. So question one is, were you able to assess the quality, construction quality of those flat roofs? And question two is was there enough data or different roof types during your damage investigations here to make any sort of judgment? I know that it's in the literature in many instances, but any judgment on vulnerability of gable versus hip versus flat roof? Were there any types of roof that seem to experience more damage than others? And then the first question again was about the flat roof specifically. Were you able to assess the construction quality?
So what I can definitely say towards that first off is that hip roofs are definitely much stronger than gable roofs. That's been shown by a lot of research in the past, and there's two reasons for that. The one is just the aerodynamic shape. A hip roof is more of a pyramid shape, whereas a gable roof is a tent shape. And the other reason that hip roofs are stronger is that they have roof-to-wall connections, those toenails, on all four sides of the house or the structure, whereas a gable roof will only have those connections along two sides of the structure and not at the actual gable ends. As for flat roofs and evaluating them during the aftermath of the storm, one of the difficulties is that the flat roofs broke apart a lot and were some of them thrown quite a distance in that area, and it can be very hard to determine what debris came from which structure. So that's something we're still going through. But that the one example of debris, some of those toenail connections we showed, we know were from that hip roof that did lose some of its roof structure. I can pull it up quickly. Yeah, this one on the left here, most of the hip roofs received very little damage, and so we were quite certain that some of those nail deficient connections were from this hip roof that did lose its roof structure, because hip roofs are normally stronger. To my knowledge, hip roofs are stronger than flat roofs. I don't have a lot of experience with flat roofs. I'm not sure if I don't think Amelia does either. But from what we saw here, I would definitely say that the hip roofs fared a lot better than both gable and flat roofs. Okay, great, thank you. So a question from one of our online participants again. How did you estimate the capacity of the connections in the trusses when you said they only had a portion of the code requirement? So I guess the question is related to maybe how do we have knowledge on the uplift capacity of 1 versus 2 versus 3 nails, and what are the what are the guidelines, what are the findings in that are available to tell us about the differences between those connections? Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of research has been on that. I can cite two specific papers. There was one done in the aftermath of the Angus, Ontario tornado in 2014. The paper was released in 2016. Emilio could probably tell you in a second the name of the paper and all the authors. I know he was one of them. And they specifically looked at the comparison between a roof with 3 nails, a roof with 2 nails, 1 nail, and no nails. And they found quite a reduction. And I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but they are in that paper. And then there's another one done that also was it a thesis? Thesis. Yeah, a thesis done under Dr. Kopp, and that one showed a 33% reduction in strength. with nail deficient toenail connections. So there's, yeah, okay, here's the paper. It's by Mohammed Khan or Khan, sorry for pronunciation. But yeah, so there are a few papers that we specifically looked at that have examined this topic.
Okay. Well, so maybe the questionnaire, if they're interested in the topic, they can send you guys an email and you can organize some materials for them.
They would be more than welcome to do that.
Yep. So we do have a sizable, I think, insurance audience today. One question from Gita, who's online, and we did talk a bit about photos. You know, some things are hard to identify using photos, but I'm not sure if this is on offer. Do you use photos of damaged homes from insurance adjusters for your data collection or analysis? You know, or maybe would you if you don't?
We currently do not. I guess we don't have the contact with insurance adjusters quite yet. Honestly, when we're in the field, oftentimes residents mistake us for insurance adjusters. But yeah, we'd be happy to receive any additional pictures of damaged houses or anything from insurance adjusters. This would help with our data collection. We'd love to add those kind of extra things to our database to just continue growing this as big as we can.
Yeah, great. So I suppose there's an open request. Anybody online here that has any photos they'd be willing to share, please do contact Emilio and Aaron and share what you have. There is a quote related to data. There's a question from Nick. Can you direct us to where the data is being housed and can we access it?
So we haven't made everything publicly available yet. We're still working on that. That's going to be through Western Libraries. Ideally, that should be set up in the future where we'll have our aerial survey images, everything we collect in the field, etc. That will be on the Western Library server eventually. It's still a work in progress, however.
Okay, so to be clear, would it become eventually maybe not public?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll all be publicly available eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the big goals of this project is to I know we've talked about maybe within the next year make almost everything we collect publicly available.
Oh, good, very good. Okay, question from Harshan. Related to roof to wall connections. Do you see municipalities having requirements related to roof to wall connections, use of hurricane clips and so on? Do you have any sense of the awareness of communities of potential need to address this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, so this is definitely an issue. There's a couple factors that go into it. One is just that, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people have this mentality that, it won't happen to me. And even though statistically it's unlikely for a tornado to hit any one structure, it really doesn't, it's relatively inexpensive to equip hurricane clips, but because they're not required by code in most areas, most people just don't bother with it. But they significantly increase the strength of a roof. I mean, normally, your roof's going to come off for an EF1, EF2 tornado, and hurricane clips will increase that to EF2, EF3. So yeah, and another issue is actually some people don't know they're in tornado-prone areas. So we talked to people in Ottawa after the storm that didn't even know things like that could happen. There's one woman specifically from Kansas City, and she was talking about how she would get these tornado warnings all the time in Kansas City. Nothing ever happened. And so when she was in Ottawa, she didn't think twice about a tornado ever hitting her neighborhood. So yeah, people need to know that tornadoes can hit a lot of areas of Canada, especially Ontario and the prairie provinces in Quebec, and they need to know that hurricane clips are available and they are relatively easy and cheap to install.
Great.
Adding on to that portion, I believe a large part of it's the municipalities to increase the requirements. That's always going to be met by a lot of resistance from the Home Builders Association. even in, it's like following the story of these events, it's like on the TV, radio, etc. You'll see that the Home Builders Association still feels that it's at times it's not necessary, and until they kind of get more leeway for that, it will likely not be an adopted policy.
Okay, maybe a couple more questions, and we'll sign off here. I suppose, well, 3 questions. Actually, I should mention here, Canadian Wood Council, I included in the webinar chat box some information. They're also involved in on ground, having a look around the damages following the event, and there's going to be a presentation on November 22nd in Toronto, and there's a link there if anybody's interested in attending that event. One question is about sheathing failures, and were you able to find any of that sheathing that was removed from roofs, and look at the nailing pattern? You know, were the any missed trusses, anything like that? Would the nailing patterns, the typical 300 millimeters in the center, 150 on the edges? Any findings related to roof sheathing?
For the most part, it was difficult to find the sheathing panels. Many of the ones we did find, it looked as though they were roughly the 300, but for the most part, many of the sheathing panels we were just unable to locate due to how far they've flown. We were more likely to find trusses. Another big issue is at the times when we were able to find some of the sheathing, there were portions where it was just a giant pile of debris, so making it difficult to go through the whole thing to find exactly where we were looking for.
Okay. Okay, and I think maybe last question here. I think with you, Emilio, you mentioned very quickly the concept of damage that occurred out of order versus in order, and out of order damage indicates construction issues, that sort of thing. Could you run over what you would consider to be in order damage, and then maybe some of your observations about out of order damage?
Here, I can start it off.
Okay.
So in my past experience with the Angus tornado, that was in that storm, that was heavy signs of degree of damages being out of order. I'm showing on the screen now the damage indicators in the current EF scale. I'll just give some initial thoughts and then pass it back to Aaron. So one of the issues in Angus is we had houses there that had exterior walls coming out when the roof of the house was still on. That shows that's an out of sequence event, as typically the roof comes off first and then we'll have the walls come out. And that showed inadequate connections from the wall to the rest of the building. Typically, we want to see failures of the shingles coming off, sheathing, and then roof failures, then walls, and then complete destruction of building.
Yeah, so just to add on to that a little bit, because that I actually did mention that during my part.
Sorry about that.
With it as well. So when I talked to them, just flip to the slide quickly. Yeah, so I talked about it here on this structure, but as a better example, I'll flip to here. So this building would be an example of that. So, but when I say in order, I mean in order of the degrees of damage for a certain damage indicator. So, for example, I'm showing the damage indicator of wood frame houses here that Emilio was just looking at. And, we'd first expect to see, some loss of roof covering, and then some, broken windows and uplift of roof deck, and then the, loss of roof structure. So if looking at this house on the right here, and which I briefly mentioned, the windows aren't broken here, which is something that happens at DOD 3 at, wind speed between 125, 185 kilometers an hour. However, it has significant portions of roof missing, which is something associated with DOD 6. So when you get something out of order like that, something that that fails, which would usually fail at a higher wind speed, a lot of the time that can point towards deficiencies in the connections of the thing that failed.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up here. Again, there's an open invitation from Aaron and Emilio. If you do have any information you'd like to share, pictures, that sort of thing, please do pass it on. Also, we'll have their presentation available on our YouTube channel pretty soon, and slides as well. Any last thoughts before we sign off? Aaron or Emilio?
We're just happy to have you here with us, and yeah, it's like if there's any more information about the Ottawa tornado, we'd be happy to, if you sent it our way, and we can add to our database. And I can't stress enough how much I'd like to thank the other members of our team for their help. The Northern Tornadoes Project is a big project, and we could not do what we do without the support of the other members of our team.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure presenting.
Well, great. Thanks very much for taking the time to present, and it was extremely informative, and we'll keep an eye out for, I suppose, publications, that sort of thing that'll come out of this work over the coming months and years, and also look forward to continuing to keep up on the Northern Tornadoes Project. So thank you again, Emilio and Aaron, and thank you everyone for joining. And with that, that ends the webinar.